Okay, so this is Metaphor by A.M. MacIver in Analysis, right? And we'll find out if I've read this before, but I don't remember at the moment. Okay, anywho, for anyone else out there, thank you Cinesemiotics for the suggestion, and everyone feel free to ask questions as we go. So, at the beginning of his article, The Description of Logical Properties, it seems to me that Mr. Britton is on the verge of making a very important point and then just fails to make it. Oh, you found it after? Maybe that's what happened. I wouldn't be surprised, because I think we were talking about something similar, and maybe you went looking and you found this afterwards. Okay, so Mr. Britton observes that the invention of new metaphors is the normal means by which vocabulary is extended, yet cannot shake himself free of the notion that the distinction between metaphor and non-metaphorical expression is absolute. Giggity. But in the sense in which Mr. Britton is using the term metaphor, this is not the case. In that case, either every expression is metaphorical, or at least non-metaphorical expressions cannot be identified, or else the difference is only one of degree and very largely a matter of individual attitude. I'm on the most everything is a metaphor. It's extremely hard to pin down what is like the real. I mean, recently I've been talking about like the objects of the world, like in some of my stuff I've been looking at. The idea that you're talking about any like object and that's like fundamental is it seems normal when you're doing it until someone pushes you on the metaphysics. Because I was talking about like different ways to refer to things. So if you're talking about Superman, you can also refer to him as Clark Kent, and both of those are names for the one object, the man, the person that both of those names refer to. De dicto and de re. The problem is if you have a theory of like, metaphysics where people aren't fundamental, like only, physical objects are, like, atoms and electrons and whatnot, and chemicals or whatever, then the idea that you've got a man, that's just atoms arranged person-wise. And so, again, the name man is really only a metaphor or some sort of abstract thing on whatever the physics is. So I'm on the mostly everything as an expression is somewhat metaphorical, at least. So, but the author continues. It would be better perhaps to say that one of the most commonest ways in which vocabulary is extended is extension by meaning by analogy, and that metaphor is the name we give to this extension when it is so blatant that we notice it. Well, that's fair. Like when we want to talk about something new, you analogize, you say something is like something else, and then you make a metaphor of it, and that's just when we're naming it. A metaphor is alive for us in the proportion as we are conscious of the original meaning while accepting the extension. But this consciousness differs from one person to another, and even in the same person from one occasion or context to another. Well, that's very fair. You can say, oh, this is like something else, and then you can say, well, it is like something else, or you could say maybe it's not so much like that. And if you just say metaphor like it just is that, then you either accept that one thing is like something else, or it's not like that. But you have to either like just sort of inherently understand what is being meant there, or you don't. Author says, I feel that Mr. Britton still hankers after the mathematician's ideal language as a system of symbols with meanings fixed by definitions. But this is not the nature of a language in the sense of a social instrument of communication. Certainly there are special uses of language, namely where words are used partly as counters for calculation, in which some words function simply as abbreviations for the longer phrases, the definitions, and their meanings are then fixed so long as they are being used in that way. Such as the use of words as technical terms in the sciences. Yeah, I mean as abbreviations. That's definitely one very specific use of things like this. Author says, but these are abnormal, though certainly not improper uses, and operate only within the framework of the normal use of language, for all technical terms must ultimately be defined by the use of words whose meaning is known without definition. In the natural use of language, words do not stand for precise meanings, but only offer hints which a hearer must interpret by intelligent guesswork. Somebody utters a sentence and we seek to understand what he means by it. Knowledge by the conventions of the language tells us not that just one thing is the proper meaning of this sentence, but only that in a large range of possible meanings there is an order of preference, some being more likely than others, while an infinite number of meanings are so improbable that they may reasonably be called impossible. Out of all the possible meanings we have to guess which the speaker intended by the use of any evidence at our disposal. I mean, this is somewhat fair. Quite often I feel like you can get pretty accurate on what people mean, but yeah, you have to narrow things down from a wide range of possibilities. Cinesemiac says, just to say what I think is very interesting on top of its content is a context in time. This paper was published in 1940. Yeah, I was thinking about that too. I was thinking about all the stuff that came out after this, or recently after this. So a lot of stuff happened, in the 40s, later in the 40s, in the 50s and the 60s. So this is basically, if this is coming out in 1940, that means it was written in the late 30s probably. And so you can be thinking about that, like, remember, War is probably Analysis is a British journal, and this person's obviously well versed in English, so they're part of the English speaking world. The world is going to war right now. It's 1940. So yeah. This is an interesting time for a paper on metaphor and getting fixed meanings. Like, this is an uncertain time, and maybe this is a sort of an uncertain meaning. Literally, these thinkers were unaware of the Holocaust as they wrote. Yes, I mean, this is like before any of the atrocities of the war were probably known to these folks. Yeah, so. But like, this is, I don't know exactly, like I said, this is, depending when this was written, it could have been like even like mid-30s. So war may not have even broken out. This may have been like, sitting on someone's desk and then got published a little later. So like this may have been like, people may even have been thinking that war was avoidable at this time. Although clearly it was published in 1940, so probably not. But it's still possible that this was like, a paper originally developed in like 1934 or 35, 36, sat around for a while, and then finally got published. I mean, let's see. Does it say what year Mr. Britain is? Okay. So, this is actually a response paper to something that got published in June 1940. So, because that's when the Mr. Britain paper came out. It says in the footnote. I doubt you guys can see this little thing down here. But, like, yeah, that's what it is. You admit to being fascinated by the trends in humanities that correspond with wars? Yeah, there's a lot of things that go on. I don't think you were here, but we were talking about a paper by Husserl on the difficulty of science. Yeah, well, 1940, yeah, sure. But I was looking at the paper that this paper is responding to, and that paper is in this footnote here on the bottom, in June 1940. So this was written in 1940 after June, or maybe if this guy got an advanced copy, it was still written in 1940. So this is at like, in World War II times. This is funny. The author says, I own that it is rather unfair to pursue Mr. Britain for this when there are so many worse offenders. Yeah, so this is completely fresh, so we can actually date when this was written. Obviously, there's other people that are making the same mistake as Mr. Britain, but this paper exactly was written at least after June 1940, and then got published probably Analysis tends to publish a few times a year, so this, and since this is the October issue, yeah, so this is like, the fall issue, this came out in the next as a response paper. So, it was written quite soon after, at least it was probably written June, July, then got sent in, and then they published it in the October issue. Yeah. Okay, so you have to, when someone says something, you have to figure out what they're saying. This is a common experience. You're not exactly sure what they mean, and then you have to sort of narrow down the possibilities, and it's not exactly accurate that do they mean this, this, and this, and then you decide they must mean the first one. Yes, you can do that sometimes. Quite often when people are talking, you don't need to narrow things down. That's not really how we, that's the less likely situation. When someone talks, you listen and you understand. Then if you are unsure, then you have to narrow it down. But that's only in the more unusual cases. So it's an interest, like, you have to wonder exactly, I'm not even sure is which one the author here, MacIver, thinks is the number one thing that we do. Do we narrow everything down every time, or do we just listen, we understand, and then when we don't understand something, go back and try to do this sort of rational analysis to figure out which is the most likely meaning? Okay. So commonly we do this immediately. For commonly we know what sort of thing a speaker wants to say even before he says it. Okay, so immediately here I kind of disagree. This is what I just said. We don't have an experience of narrowing down what people say when we are just normally in conversation. We just understand. I don't think I have to like go through a few different possibilities when people are talking in a normal way. Often when you don't understand, you do it, but like you see the author here, I already have a slight disagreement with that, because they're just saying we do this narrowing down, but there's no evidence for us doing this every time. We just sort of get it quite often. Okay. Author says, but sometimes it may take a moment's thought, for example, by the question, were you at Oxford? I shall normally understand, were you an undergrad at Oxford University? But I can easily imagine circumstances when, in conversation with a fellow philosopher, I might need a moment's reflection to guess whether he meant this by it, or did you attend the Mind Association and Aristotelian Society joint session at Oxford in 1938? And sometimes in reading a philosophical book, particularly the work of a representative of a school of thought which I am out of sympathy, it may require an exercise in speculative intellectual biography to get the author's meaning. Out of all the meanings which the passage might possibly bear, I can only guess which the writer intended by trying to think for myself along the lines on which his mind was working, and thus to discover what sort of thing he would be wanting to say. Yeah, I mean, this is fair. If you are trying to figure out something you don't understand, and this person is saying, oh, I'm out of sympathy, this may be an old version of the word sympathy, not in so much feeling bad for a person, but out of the feeling like a feeling of maybe experience with the people, so you don't have the same sort of sympathetic response, like a sympathetic response in like the technical sense of sympathetic response, where you act in the same way. So this person is saying somebody, I don't have the common background and reactions as someone in another school, so I have to somehow generate a version of them to figure out what they might be talking about here. And that's fair. You have to say, well, why is someone like this saying it? Well, they may be thinking along these lines even though it's not me. Continuing. Graphically expressed, for those who find visual images helpful, the meaning which belongs to a word, which we know by knowing the language, is not a point but an area, somewhere within which we shall find the meaning intended by any particular occurrence of the word. And the boundaries of this area are indefinite and inextensible. That this should be so follows inevitably from the smallness of any vocabulary in comparison with the infinite variety of circumstances which have to be coped with linguistically. Suppose a philosophical Esperanto constructed according to the mathematical ideal, with a precise sense defined for every word, and suppose it actually adopted as a language by a community. Before it had been in regular use 24 hours, its words would begin to develop extensions of meaning not provided for in its author's definitions. Yeah, so this is saying even if you have a technical language, the use of it will have to immediately adapt to new situations, just because that's how people are. And I think that's right. Even a vocabulary as large or larger than the whole New English Dictionary could only provide for circumstances that have already arisen in the past. It could make no provision for the continuous series of new scientific discoveries, new technical inventions, new political and social developments. And the number of words which a person has actually at his command for speaking at any given moment is commonly even less than the number that he would understand if he heard or read. We all know the experience of being at a loss for a word, although the word that we need is one with which we are perfectly familiar. When for any reason we are short of a word to express a meaning that we wish to convey, we force some other word to act as a substitute on the strength of some more or less remote analogy. And this is not a misuse of language, but its natural state. It is a breach indeed of the courtesies of speaking and writing to put upon a hearer or reader a burden of interpretation which might have been avoided, so that we should not use an expression which could easily be misunderstood if we can find another which leaves less room for misunderstanding in its context. And perhaps we owe a moral duty to posterity not to impoverish the language by habitually extending the meanings of words unnecessarily in such a way that useful differences might become obliterated. But the primary purpose of language is simply to convey our meanings, and if this is achieved, subject to the above limitations, it cannot be said that language has been misused. Okay, yeah, so there's always two ways of doing stuff. You can have a word that exactly means what you say, and you can use that word, or you can use a group of other words in a certain, grammatical sense to also point to a very similar or the same thought. You just have to say, well, I mean this and this and this in this way, and then you can get by talking about what you mean to exactly say, you can say exactly what you want, or you could have a word that actually just happens to mean that to begin with. But again, this is the normal way things are. You can do things, there's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's more than one way to get your point across. You can have the right word, or you can use a lot of other words to, zero in on it. Home in on meanings. Continuing. Almost all neologisms, even technical terms, are introduced in this way by extension, not by definition. Such cases as the name of a new chemical element introduced by quasi-ostensive definition, quote, if you perform such and such operations, you will find a metal of such and such character. We will call this molybdenum. Are the exception. Yeah, because when you're just giving a description, that's different. The first engineer to use the term sparking plug probably never offered any explanation of what he meant by it. Given the context of an internal combustion engine electrically ignited, it would be immediately evident what the thing was intended from its resemblance to other things called plug in shape and in being screwed into a hole. In fact, what is most commonly introduced by definition is not a new term or new meaning, but only a restriction imposed for the purposes of a particular discussion on an earlier, actual or possible, natural extension. I make a technical term not by inventing a new word or even by giving an old word a new sense, but by singling out one of the senses in which a word might already be understood and announcing that, in this context, I am not going to use it in any other. That's fair. This is a good point, actually, that a lot of things we are doing when talking about technical senses is we're just talking about one already known sense, and we're saying we only mean this one thing, and that is a lot of times what goes by the term clarity in philosophy, even though it's a dumb way of being clear, of only using one sense, because that's usually a very artificial thing. But this is quite often what happens a lot, and I think this author has zeroed in on something that does happen a lot and isn't really spoken about too much. It's not a neologism, it's just a very technical restriction, and that's a good point. Okay, now, is not this process of extinction by analogy essentially the same as what in literary criticism is called metaphor? Metaphor is simply the application to one thing of a name properly, that is, it's in its normal usage hitherto, belonging to something else on the strength of some more or less remote resemblance connecting them. Mr. Britton, following Dr. Richards, observes quite correctly that it need not be a resemblance between the things themselves. It may, for example, be a resemblance between our feelings with regard to them, but this does not affect the issue. It is true that metaphor in this sense may be used for two almost diametrically opposite purposes. Whoever first introduced the term sparking plug, I guess you call it spark plug now, but yeah, spark plug, was only making use of a resemblance in order to speak of something for which language otherwise lacked a name. The more immediately obvious the resemblance, the better to his purpose, which was to be understood. A poet, on the other hand, uses a metaphor to point out a resemblance, perhaps a very subtle one, perhaps several at once. If the resemblance were obvious to anybody, his metaphor would be stale. On the other hand, it ought to be comparatively obvious what he is talking about, or the whole point of his observation will be missed. Okay, so a good example for this, and it's because this is still around, is insults. So if you call someone a bitch nowadays, it usually just means you don't like them or something they're doing. The whole point of calling someone a bitch is to say that they are acting like a female dog in heat, running around, putting their ass everywhere, trying to get, have sex with like any dog whatsoever. So that's what you're saying, is like when you're calling someone a bitch, you're saying they're acting like they're just trying to fuck anything that like that's walking. We don't use it in that sense anymore. And so what's happened in some sense, this example's from Lewis, I think, C.S. Lewis or C.I. Lewis in the 50s. So this is from at least 10 or probably 15 years later in Lewis's book. You hate it when people do that? What? Just use words, But yeah, so this is an example from the 50s. You can explain what part of what I said you hate. But this is the thing. If you want to actually insult someone, there has to be something that actually is like, there is some sort of resemblance one way or the other, that their behavior is in there. But only in the sense I defined it. Oh, thank you. My technical sense. Yeah, so when something is just, when you're saying somebody is insulting and you're saying you don't like them, they're not actually giving you a resemblance. They're just giving you their opinion about it being bad. If you're saying someone is acting in this way, this indecorous way, I remember Lewis putting it, like saying they're acting indecorously, which is a nice old term saying. A way of putting that, like they're acting like a bitch, is indecorously, because they're running around to fuck everything. But like, this is the thing. So this is the point, is that you're saying, well, okay, a spark plug puts two words together because someone would know what a plug that makes sparks do. But of course, we've never seen that before. But if you're calling someone a bitch, as opposed to you're describing their behavior by metaphorically, and that's the same thing the spark plug is doing, because it is similar to a plug that happens to be sparking. Yeah, literally acting like cow-like behavior. Yeah, so that's the thing. It's if you want to insult someone, if you want something to hurt, like if you want to reach out and smack someone without actually having to use your hand, you find something that they find bad, and then you use that metaphor with respect to them, and then they will have to like see themselves as the bad thing. So that's what it was. Like, if you actually thought like dogs like in heat were acting like idiots, and then you describe someone that way, then they will feel bad because they're acting like something that they don't like. Yeah. So if you the point is that if it's too far away, there's no resemblance, the author is saying, of course, the observation will be missed. Sometimes authors and poets use obscure metaphors, and then you lose the point at that point. Okay. Author says, thus in Mr. Britton's example, pale, silver-proud queen woman of the sky, we must already have guessed that he is talking about the moon. Yeah, because like silver and in sky. Like the pale silver. I mean, there's not a whole lot else that would be other than the moon. But like, yeah. But calling a proud queen woman is giving a certain representation to the moon that is not that descriptive. It's something else, metaphorical. Okay. Perhaps it might be convenient to restrict the term metaphor to metaphors used in this latter, the poetic way, and I fancy that the possibility of such a usage lies at the back of Mr. Britton's conviction that there can be absolutely non-metaphorical expressions. But this is not the way in which Mr. Britton is actually using the term. His concern with logical terms such as consequence, implication, opposition, and the like, and these are metaphorical only in the sense that they originated in extent. Wait, what's it say? He is concerned with logical terms such as consequence, implication, opposition, and the like, And these are metaphorical only in the sense that they originated in extension by analogy. Whoever first introduced them did not wish to point out a resemblance, but only to make use of it. Okay, I mean, sure, you can say that a consequence is a metaphor to some sort of other thing that happened. But like, yeah, exactly what is that a metaphor of? I don't know. Author says, a metaphor is alive for us so long as we are conscious of its metaphorical, remember the original sense even in the act of accepting the extinction. It is moribund as soon as the extinction becomes so familiar that we may accept it without thinking of the original sense. Yeah, because once you lose the original sense, like when you call someone a bitch nowadays, it has usually no one's thinking about dogs actually. You're saying you don't like them, and then so it becomes so familiar and you're accepting it without thinking of the original dog example. Yeah, but so long as the original sense is one which we are also familiar, the metaphor may always come to life again, if anything in the context or circumstances, or even the chance vagaries of our thought remind us of that sense. For example, in the sentence, I went fishing last week and caught a cold, a very dead metaphor comes to life with ludicrous effect for a hearer who happens to be expecting the name of a kind of fish. Yeah, so, I mean, maybe if they're British, cold and cod are very similar words, and so it's a very bad joke right here. But like a very, very dead metaphor may come to life. Like, bad joke. A metaphor is only completely dead for someone who has wholly forgotten the original sense of the expression or never known it. Thus, Burke, as a synonym for stifle in the phrase to Burke discussion, which was a very live metaphor for our ancestors, has become quite dead for most people now, when hardly anyone thinks about Burke and Hare murders of more than a century ago. Oh, so that's interesting. Yeah, to Burke is like they were using it to kill a discussion. Thus, we get what might be called philologists' metaphors, expressions which were once metaphorical but are now not so, except for those who are acquainted with the past history of language. Such in particular are expressions borrowed from one language into another, which were metaphorical in the first language but never in the second. For example, the word kindergarten may still be metaphorical sometimes for Germans, but not for Englishmen who know no German. It is interesting that most of Mr. Britton's examples are metaphors only in this antiquarian sense, being borrowed from the Latin in which they were already logical terms. It is true that most of them also occur in English with non-logical senses, but to the average Englishman this can only be a brute fact about the language as he finds it, like the fact that to lie means either to be recumbent or to tell an untruth, not a metaphorical extension. To see the connection, for example, between subject in the logical sense and in the expressions a British subject or subject to asthma requires not only some knowledge of Latin, but a quite respectable acquaintance with the history of logic. Yeah, I mean, the idea that you're going to find the same word subject in like the linguistics or the subject of a logical property, like in terms of a variable, is very different from like the history of like subject to asthma as being under the sway of a disease. So yeah. So this is a question, like when does a metaphor stop being a metaphor, and are there things that are non-metaphorical in this hard sense that were always what they were? I don't know. In light of these observations, we may perhaps find Mr. Britton's article rather unconvincing. The burden of his argument is that mistaken theories in logic are encouraged by the fact that the common logical terms are metaphors derived from non-logical sources. So this is what I was just thinking. I mean, where are these coming from? This may be so, I think that sometimes it is. But in order to prove his point, he would have had to show in each particular case that the expression is still generally felt as a metaphor, for otherwise how could it mislead? And it seems to me that in most of the cases which he actually quotes, he would fail. But I am not really concerned with this point here. I found much more interesting the point which he expressly refuses to make, though things which he observes seem to lead straight toward it, namely that all language is metaphorical more or less. This is what I was saying earlier. Though it always makes a simpler picture to draw sharp distinctions between X and non-X, our picture is generally more accurate if we recognize gradations of Xness over the whole field. It does not matter in which of three possible ways we choose to employ the term metaphor. Even if one, we confine it to metaphors used in the poetic way, that is to transferences of words made for the purpose of pointing out a resemblance, it would often be difficult to decide whether an expression was metaphorical or non-metaphorical, for there are many kinds of speaking and writing which are half informative, half poetic, where a not too subtle resemblance is used to provide language with a new word, and yet part of the end in view is to call attention to the resemblance. As if I should speak of someone pecking away at the typewriter, where it may be hard to decide how far I am using the resemblance of his action to that of a pecking fowl, simply to supply the lack of another word to describe the action, and how far I actually want to point out the resemblance. Oh my god. These sentences are so long, though. This old style of writing, it's a little crazy. I think this whole thing from this one up here, there's like from up here all the way down to here, this whole paragraph is basically one sentence combined with semicolons. Anywho, but yeah, so like the author's basically saying, look, if everything's a metaphor, then you're gonna have a lot of gradations of it. They were the metaphor for the coming breakup of Europe. Semicolons, yes. Yeah. Europe would be peppered with dire critics and more. Cutting sentences short. Yeah. I mean, was that meant to be diacritics or dire critics? Maybe both. Okay, if two, so that was the first one where everything's a metaphor of perhaps gradation. If two, we restricted the term metaphor to live metaphors, we should have to allow that an expression which was non-metaphorical for one man might always be a metaphor for another. You are a poet, your text speaks for itself. Yes, your text does speak. So, and what was I'm not going to even try to answer on its behalf then. Which was non-metaphorical for one man might always be a metaphor for another, depending on his knowledge and even on the momentary direction of his thought. Yeah, so if you're always comparing something to something else in your head, then everything's a metaphor for you because you are always doing the metaphorical act of comparing one thing to another. Okay, if three, we use the term as Mr. Britton does when he calls the word inference a metaphor from carrying and a subject a metaphor from throwing, which can only mean that their present senses are the result of a series of analogical extensions in the remote past, then there may indeed be some words in some languages which are non-metaphorical, that is, which are still used in the senses which Adam gave to them in the Garden of Eden, but we have no means of telling which words they are, or whether there are any of them in any particular language, such as modern English. And it is much more likely that, with the obvious exception of a few words known to have been invented, like molybdenum, there is not a single word or expression in present-day use which is not, in this antiquarian sense, metaphorical. That is, in the sense that, if only we could trace its history far enough back, we should find that its present meaning originated in an extinction of an older meaning, though that older meaning may now be completely forgotten. Yeah, okay. So I like this article. It's a lot of fun. It's classic philosophy of language and logic sort of stuff. Yeah. So the question is, what is a metaphor then? Is everything a metaphor? Well, in a historical sense, yes. If, it's like in the sense that we're always pointing out some other, thing, I mean, that's a matter of degree. And if you're using it in the, like, live metaphor, like, it's a question of action. Like, is a metaphor a speech act that has to do with the way you are connecting your words to, like, your thoughts? And then, yeah. But, like, that's different. So, see, well, so what's the point? I mean, so I don't know what was Mr. Britton's argument, rather unconvincing. All three of those things are kind of unlikely situations. So let's see. What is the whole thing? What was the important thing here then? That like how we get new words is by metaphor? Well, I guess that's the thing. How do we extend language? It's that we need to make new metaphors, basically. That's the thing. And so the idea that everything is metaphor, I guess, is wrong because it does not allow for new metaphors. So that's the real thing. How do we actually come up with new thoughts? And that's the issue here. The idea, I guess, also is that the author here is angry that Mr. Britton is saying that we have metaphors even where they don't appear to be, which is with like the logical terms, because we can't actually, there is no one who's using them as metaphors. I mean, in the historical sense, then everything's a metaphor, but that's too vague, too wide, too whatever. No one cares. Of course, there's a history behind all the words, and things meant slightly different things in the past, but like that's not a metaphor really. So it's like, how do we actually understand metaphors? In this case, there's got to be something else going on, and that is a different thing. So that's not really metaphor in the logical sense when you're talking about like induction, deduction, and things like that, inference, reference, relation. So yeah, there's a little footnote here where originally these terms came from like carrying and throwing, but the idea that like anyone's using it that way anymore is just wrong. So I mean, my whole point when I say everything's metaphor is that basically everything's shaky. I'm in the sort of like, there is no, any technical stuff we're saying is always going to be in that very limited sense, and as soon as you try and get out of any sort of try to push that technical sense to anything more substantial, it's not going to work, or things are going to start breaking very quickly. And so everything that we're saying usually only has a limited applicability. And so it's a metaphor because it works really well sometimes, but it is very restricted. So when you call someone a bitch in the old sense that they're acting like a dog, it only works insofar as they are acting like a dog in heat. I mean, if you want to just lose the sense of the word and use bitch as a generic insult, then yeah, you could do that. But again, that loses all meaning. It just means I don't like them, I think they're bad. And you might as well just say boo person, like boo you, like you're bad. So, but yeah, this is real interesting stuff actually. It's like, how do you understand what a metaphor is and how language is extended? So yeah, so though it always makes a simpler picture to draw a sharp distinction between X and non-X, our picture is generally more accurate if we recognize gradations of Xness over the whole field. It does not matter in which of the three possible ways we choose to employ the term metaphor. Yeah, so any way you do it, the author here is saying it's a gradation. And that is basically, this is one of those times also when I'd say, look, where did you really get? You just got yourself 1, 2, 3, and now you added number 4, which is your preference, which is the gradation view. It's like, yeah, is it just a poetic way to transference of words? Again, why are we doing this at any given point? If you want to get people to do something, you got to make them feel it. Like, it got to get them to, like if you're insulting someone, you're trying to injure them. You're trying to make them feel bad. You're trying to get like an emotional response. So if you want to like do that, you have to actually capture some part of them. So it's like in the poetic way, the transference of words made for the purpose of pointing out a resemblance, it's not just the resemblance, it's that the resemblance has to get some feeling out of a person. That if you call someone a bitch, they have to feel like that is a very bad thing for whatever reason. Similar, again, this live metaphor, why is it live? Well, that's because it's capturing something in your head that you think is important. And so again, this is the direction of thought. Again, this is why it is. That's why it's a motivating thing. And then this history one only matters for people who care about such things. But like, again, that's fine. There's a reason why people cared about these things in the past and why they said them, and that is what's important. Now, there's a book called Studies in Words, which I read. This is basically where I'm getting my examples from. Studies in Words. And if you're interested in the sort of thing where you want to see how words have changed over time and why these metaphors have happened, then you can go look up Studies in Words. Let me go Google it real fast for y'all. Lewis, I think it was. So, yeah, C.S. Lewis. Studies in Words. You can get it, ebook for $6.99, paperback by for like $11 to $20, whatever. So, oh, come on. Come on, Amazon. There we go. So, there we go. It's Studies in Words by C.S. Lewis. And so you can look in this. He tracks the history of metaphors over the course of like their lives. So you've got words like, what is it to be sad? Sad comes from the word sated, which we don't use as much, but it means to be full. So sad actually was a metaphor for how you feel when you get stuffed with food. Like you're all like, oh, I can't move, and like I'm like stuffed. And so that metaphor became how we felt when we were unhappy. And so they didn't have a very good for how we were acting when we were unhappy. So they came up with this like, oh, you stuffed yourself with food, sort of sad. And that's what it comes from, sated. So you're like sated, even though that doesn't have anything to do with how you feel when you're just unhappy. Although it kind of is how you are when you are stuffed with food. And so like the fact that like there's a historical sense of this, yeah, sure. But there's a reason why the people in the history used sad came from sated, because there was an experience there that they had actually thought was similar. So it's the direction of the thought at the time, which is this restricted the number 2 sense, or that there's a purpose of resemblance that's going on, like you're acting like you are stuffed with food when you're sad. So that's the thing. Now the question is there always a gradation? I agree with this author, but I think the best part of this paper, which I quite like, is that it shows that if you're trying to nail down what the actual meanings of words are, it's super hard. And if you know the history of 20th century analytic philosophy, where they're trying to nail down the meanings of these things, a lot of stuff happened on all these terms and whatnot. So are they just metaphorical? Can't just be metaphorical. There's reasons why people are kind of stuck with a lot of the terms we are, is because they have like these sort of technical uses that aren't just metaphorical. But how did we get there, and why did people go in these directions? There are definite experiences that and problems in the math, in the philosophy, in the history of this stuff that do matter. So is everything metaphor? No, because you need to have something outside the metaphor to cause someone to want to do this stuff. And I think that's really what's going on here. So you want to always say, look, sometimes, yeah, you're just comparing something in the metaphorical way, but other times it's a little less. It's something else is going on there. And that's really a good point that this author makes. So, and that's right over here. Yeah, it doesn't matter which one. It doesn't matter where you're getting the kind of metaphor. It's that there's something else going on. So, simpler picture to draw a sharp distinction between X and non-X. It's more accurate if you recognize. And I don't love this sort of gradations of Xness over the whole field. It's that the ones that are less metaphorical, that there's some other reason, or the ones that are metaphorical, there's something else going on too. So, okay. That is it for this. Unless let me know if anyone has any questions.